Good afternoon. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability, and I'm very happy to welcome those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us via Zoom today to this, the third presentation in our Spring 2026 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. Our office is proud to co-sponsor this series with our colleagues in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs and the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. We're particularly happy today to welcome back Professor Ellie Brown, who presented a few years back. I think it was the pandemic presentation online. And we're just excited to have her here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellie Brown.
Thank you. Thanks for coming today, and big you made this possible through the Office of Sustainability and also the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. Also want to acknowledge the support for this work through multiple places at Westchester, including my research team, the Early Childhood Cognition and Emotions Lab, Excel. A couple of you from Excel are here, which is awesome. The Office of Research and Sponsored Programs has and our Head Start preschool partners. So I'm going to be talking today about a lot of research that we've done collaboratively with preschools in the community that are Head Start sites. So big thanks to those partners for collaboration, particularly Settlement Music School and their Kaleidoscope Preschool Arts Enrichment Program has been a longtime partner. The director there, Terrell Davis, is a colleague and collaborator in this work. And we've received grant funding and support through a variety of mechanisms, including Brandywine Communication Technologies, the Marazzo Family Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. So I think we all come here with a shared interest in sustainability, and my guess is that many of you have taken a look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and if you have, you might remember that the number one goal on that list is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So ending poverty goes hand in hand with environmental sustainability. The targets under that goal include aiming for a world where the poor are not vulnerable to climate change and have equal rights to economic resources. And poverty in the United States is the focus of my own research, and I'll acknowledge I have not faced economic hardship myself. My positionality is being raised in an upper middle class household, but a lot of members of my extended family are living in poverty, and I grew up very close to many people experiencing economic hardship on a daily basis, so that's part of where my personal motivation for this work comes from. In the U.S., about 15% of children face poverty circumstances, are growing up in households classified as impoverished, and about twice that number, about 30% of children are growing up in households classified as low income, and so facing economic hardship. And decades of research have established that children facing economic hardship also face risk for difficulties in multiple domains, in terms of cognition and learning, in terms of social emotional functioning, and even in terms of physical health function. In 2001, Sonia Lupien and colleagues asked, can poverty get under the skin? Are there ways that poverty can influence specifically physiological systems that respond to stress? And the answer was a resounding yes. Poverty influences the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis. We can measure that by way of one of its key end products, the stress hormone cortisol, which we can measure back, and she's demonstrating placing a swab in her in your mouth for a minute to collect saliva, as Kayala and others have done many times, and we put it in a tube and bring it back to the lab to assay for levels of the stress hormone, cortisol. When Sonia Lupia and colleagues first examined this, they did find an impact of poverty on cortisol. So the typical cortisol trajectory is beneficial for all of us. Cortisol supports daily functions like metabolism, learning, immune function, and we start out with our steepest levels just after morning wake up. Those levels have a steep decline, then a gradual decline across the remainder of the day to bedtime. The steep morning levels could be why you might want carbohydrates in the morning, why you might want a bagel. You're kind of mobilizing energy to meet challenges of the day. And it's also why, not necessarily just after we wake up, but when we have moderate levels of cortisol, kind of that mid-morning time point might be when we learn best. That's because cortisol is helping us to mobilize the energy to learn. So cortisol is a good thing, but children who are growing up in poverty, particularly in the early years, are experiencing stressors that can lead to elevations in cortisol. Now, elevations in cortisol to respond to stress also can be a good thing. So, if we experience something stressful, let's say there's an accident on our corner of the block, and there are sirens and emergency vehicles, and maybe we want to see what's happening. It's good to have a rise in cortisol to mobilize energy to respond to a situation like that. And so you can see that response here, and typically the cortisol level would come back down. But if there are always or persistently stressful things to respond to, then over time your cortisol levels can become elevated at baseline. And that's what Sonia Lupia and colleagues first documented for children facing poverty circumstances. That's thought to actually explain a lot of the difficulties that children growing up with economic hardship face in terms of cognition and learning, in terms of social emotional function, and even physical health function. Cortisol is a really powerful hormone, and in particular, it is powerful because it influences brain areas involved in learning and cognition, like the hippocampus, right? You might have learned about that being linked to learning and memory. The amygdala we think about as an emotion reaction center. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that in psychology we talk about being associated with executive functions, the ability control or inhibit prepotent responses, your impulses to respond in a certain way so that you can actually, consider social constraints and respond in the best way appropriate within a given situation, right? So cortisol is essential for all those areas to function well. Yeah, did you have a question?
So I was wondering, is it the same for adults, or is it just more impactful on children because their brain is so developing?
Yes, really good question. So for those of you on Zoom, the question was, is it the same for adults or is it more powerful for children because their brains are still developing? And that's exactly the case. So for all of us, cortisol is influencing these brain areas, but for children, they're still developing, right? And you've probably heard 90% of brain growth and development takes place in the first 5 years of life. Well, these are some of the areas that are critically developing during early childhood. And so if you have kind of just the right amount of cortisol, then your brain is developing optimally. But too much cortisol and these areas are not able to function optimally in the moment. Again, not because it's not good to have cortisol rise in response to challenge, but because your body is oriented toward doing different things. It's kind of in survival mode, in an urgent response mode with high levels of cortisol rather than a learn and sustain mode, right? So for children experiencing high levels of cortisol, they're probably not going to be responding optimally to learning challenges in the present, to emotion regulation challenges, and those brain areas are also not developing optimally, which is why it can have really lasting effects on child development. And we've documented some of those relations in the work in our lab. A 2023 study, we were looking at cortisol and children's cognitive function, again, those executive functions, so planning, organizing, paying attention, controlling impulses in the preschool setting, in Head Start preschool. And what you can see in this model is that higher levels of cortisol across the preschool day related to more difficulties with those cognitive functions. That's been established in many labs beyond ours, but that was just one example of something we studied. So when we think about poverty, we are mostly thinking about income, having insufficient income, insufficient material resources, and that really matters a lot, right? If you are facing stress about whether you can put food on the table for your family, that's inherently stressful. If parents can't maybe purchase adequate potentially a lasting effect on child development. So these things matter critically. However, they're not the whole picture. What we really find is if we look at poverty circumstances for families, one of the things that we often don't consider enough is the instability. And so, instability factors like housing insecurity, residential and relationship changes. So at any income bracket, you might move, you might change residences. Sometimes that could be a good thing, right? Move to a nicer house, a nicer neighborhood. But if you're facing unstable housing because of low income and having to move, let's say, multiple, the cortisol effects for children, the elevation, because it is so hard, that is so period of time. Similarly, relationship, many families might experience, let's say, a great living at home, dying, for any family to go through, but you're just experiencing. We're going to see elevated cortisol levels. However, changes, which again could be created, let's say, because of how a whole unit is having to live with relatives. They're moving to their own housing for another period of time and then moving back with another set of relatives. Those kinds of disruptions. 14-year-old and a 9-year-old, and there are definitely nights during the week when we don't get dinner on at 6 o'clock as planned. There are times when routines get disrupted because of my work, but that's a very different context than if a parent is like juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet or doesn't have control over their schedule and work hours to where you can never really establish or maintain consistent routines around mealtime, around bedtime, around time to read to your child at night. So those are the kinds of factors that actually end up predicting high cortisol levels for children. This is an example of one of our models, and what's interesting here is that you can see family income, the income to needs ratio, which takes into account family size, actually is not predicting high cortisol levels in this model. The things highlighted in green are child minoritized racial and ethnic status is predicting higher cortisol, and we think that's because of the effect of race-based stress. So children who are Black, Indigenous, people of color are disproportionately likely to face poverty circumstances overall, but also are likely to face additional race-based stressors that are not accounted for specifically in these models, and that is most likely what that represents. But then if you look at the additional factors highlighted, so the household chaos, so the lack of predictability at home, and those attachment disruptive relationship changes. So, maybe having a parent who has to move out of the house, maybe a grandparent figure. In this model, we mapped it out a little differently. This is a structural equation model, which it's like a lot is going on here. But I think the nice part of this statistical modeling is you can look at what's at the root, which is the income poverty, and how that, when you take into account this whole model, income poverty does not relate directly to child cortisol, but what it does relate to is economic adversity, which includes things like material hardship, financial strain, economic instability, and then the instability in particular predicts family chaos, which is, and the instability and chaos are the ones that feed in directly to child cortisol. So income poverty is kind of a root cause, but it's creating these other conditions, instability and chaos, that are what are really posing a lot of stress for young children. Sometimes in psychology, we divide these factors into physical instability and chaos factors, things like disheveled living conditions, residential crowding, noise, and psychosocial factors, residential moves, relationship changes, family conflict. Persistently exposed to instability and chaos, then what's going to happen across a shorter period of time, like maybe a couple of years, is ending up with those elevated cortisol levels. But eventually, if it's like a lot of years of living with those circumstances, you could end up with actually desensitization to stress, kind of flattened, bottomed out cortisol levels, where you're not reacting to anything anymore, right? Because your body already kind of was in overdrive for so long that then you kind of numb out and are just not responding. That's not good either, right? You can imagine that does not help us learn at our best or respond to emotional challenges at our best. So neither of those situations is a good thing. This is a quote here from Antonio Guterres saying, climate change is not the source of all ills, but it has a multiplier effect and is an aggravating factor for instability, conflict, and terrorism. And that's really what we're thinking about in the current context in terms of the instability and chaos faced by families we're working with. So, if you think about those physical and psychosocial aspects of instability and chaos, you can imagine how those are magnified, exacerbated by the climate emergency. So, if you think about just a single issue like forced relocation due to climate change, and how that could create not only residential moves, relationship changes, but for some families then also the residential crowding and the higher levels of noise. So you can imagine that magnification effect. And then of course there are new factors added by the climate emergency. So the food and water insecurity, extreme temperatures, extreme weather events, disrupted energy supply that are added in terms of additional instability factors, disruptions to employment, sociopolitical disruptions, climate anxiety, health issues, right? All of this adds. Now, families facing poverty are disproportionately likely to face all of these things. They're going to face the harshest effects, and yet you can think about how all of us are impacted to some extent by these issues and how that impact is likely to grow over the coming years. And you can think about the possible implications for larger numbers of children facing the type of instability and chaos that is linked to these high stress levels and the resultant consequences. If you've taken a developmental psychology class, then you may have seen Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of child development that places the child at the center of these concentric circles of influence. And, the things, microsystem environments, so their family, their classroom, their peer group, religious settings like a church, a synagogue, a mosque they might attend. But then beyond those, right, there's the impact of exosystem factors like the school system and the community, and then the macro system factors of poverty, of sociopolitical conditions. So if we think about how is instability and chaos influencing children, well, Bronfenbrenner said it's through proximal processes. So these macro level factors like poverty are influencing the conditions families are living with, but then where it really impacts children is through their immediate interactions with their environment, right? So things that would promote positive development would be like a safe physical environment. A child knows they're going to come home each day in winter to a house that has the heat on, right? Predictable routines, consistently positive interactions with parents, caregivers, adults around, and ideally interactions that are going to actually grow in their level of sophistication over time to scaffold children's learning as they become more complex in their own thinking and ideas, whereas detrimental processes would be things like unsafe physical circumstances, lack of structure and routine, inconsistent or negative or withdrawn parent-child interactions. And those are the things that would be mechanisms through which these more distal instability factors could influence children in their daily lives, right? So if we think about the climate emergency and proximal processes, there might be direct effects on children that they would experience just in their interactions with their immediate environment. So food insecurity, that's going to directly affect a child at home. A power disruption or flooding, those are things that would influence a child's interaction with their own immediate environment. But then there could be other aspects that are indirect, like because of the impact on parent emotions, parents' psychological well-being, and then how that carries over to the routines parents are able to structure at home or the interactions they're able to have with their children. So like one of our key models in psychology is the economic stress model, which is basically explaining that some effects of poverty on children are carried through parents' psychological well-being. Because if a parent is stressed about making ends meet, if a parent is stressed about economic circumstances, even if they're not talking about that in front of a kid, right, it's still having an impact on that parent's emotions and then is going to influence their ability to set up supportive routines at home, and that in turn influences children's social emotional well-being. And we could really substitute ecological stress for economic stress and see how the same thing is true, right, in the context of the climate emergency, that even if a child doesn't know that, let's say, Aunt Sarah is facing wildfires out in California, right, if that's taking a toll on mom or dad's well-being at home, then it still can influence the kid, right? So those are the kinds of issues we think about, and this is a paper that just kind of shows that impact of parents' psychological well-being on children's stress levels. In this model, we were looking at parent frustration and anger specifically, and children's whose parents are reporting more frustration and anger are showing higher stress levels. So really, in this model, we weren't looking at what is causing the high levels of frustration and anger, but we do know that economic stress is likely to be part of that root cause, and we can imagine, again, a magnifier effect of ecological stress, climate stress. So in our current research, we're trying to get more information about some of the environmental circumstances that families might be exposed to that we would imagine are being exacerbated by the current climate emergency. Things like air pollution and contamination, water contamination, noise pollution, sewage problems, insects, rodents, garbage problems, disorder outdoors and indoors, lack of indoor and outdoor space, things like storm damage, flooding, severe heat and cold, weather-related evacuations. And we do imagine that, these things are going to be part of the picture that, again, children living in poverty are going to be disproportionately exposed to and that are going to be causing stress for families, which are going to either directly or indirectly influence children. But we also imagine that these issues are going to affect more and more of us over the next period of time, which is one of the important reasons to understand and document the impact. Clearly, big implications are we need to end poverty, we need to end the climate emergency. Those things go hand in hand. We cannot do one without the other. And promote stability for families. There's no way to use family processes to erase the impact of poverty or to erase the impact of the climate emergency. However, we still, of course, do want to be doing what we environmental conditions, including by and so some of our research has focused on that end, and I'll transition to talk a little bit about that, like how can we support children who are facing harsh economic and environmental conditions. And one of the things we've really focused on is a combination of creativity and order. So you think about instability and chaos, and the first thing that probably jumps to mind is, okay, so we should give children a lot of structure, right? We should give them all, well, stability, yes. Some amount of structure, yes. But it's interesting because it's not just that we want children to be sitting at desks and, doing the same thing over and over. Creativity ends up being a really important part of countering the impact of poverty. In this particular study, we asked, can the arts get under the skin, right? So if you remember me talking about Sonia Lupien asking, can poverty get under the skin? So we asked, okay, if children are in high quality music, dance, visual arts classes, including, in this case, it was at a Head Start preschool where there are credentialed artist teachers and fully equipped art studios and these really beautiful circumstances for children to be engaging in these classes. Can that lower stress levels? And yes, we found lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol after children engaged in music, dance, and visual arts under these high-quality circumstances, compared to just regular homeroom or early learning classes at preschool, which are already good, right? These are already good classes, but having some of the creativity is really useful for stress reduction. And in this study, we expanded on that, looking at yoga and mindfulness too, and found, okay, not only were children's stress levels lower after dance and creative movement, but they were also lower after yoga and mindfulness classes in Head Start preschool. So these are, suggest important directions for more proximal interventions to support children facing high stress levels. We've tried to get really into the weeds in terms of, okay, if you're a teacher, if you're an arts practitioner, if you're a parent or caregiver or babysitter or therapist who's trying to work with children using the arts, what's the most effective way to do it? Like, how much do you want to provide the structure by guiding children, by telling them, okay, this is what to draw and here's how to do it, versus how much do you want to let them creatively express? And again, the answer is nuanced. It's like you really need a combination of those things. So what we found is that children, it goes best if children have some choice, if they get to have some creativity in the process, if there's child direction rather than just being told what to do and how to do it. However, teachers are, not just kind of turning their backs and saying, okay, dance with scarves however you want, and I'll be back in 15 minutes, but if they're actually engaging with children around that process, right? And we found something really similar. This is actually a manuscript that's currently under review, but it has a conditional acceptance that I'm excited about, and this was looking at different activities within the music and dance classes we've studied and looking at what activities are most powerful. So this doesn't show the whole range of activities we looked at because we looked at about 20 different activities, but the things that were most powerful: singing, playing instruments, a creative movement relay where children were making up movements to pass around a circle to their partner. all of these were things that involved some combination of structure and creativity. Children's active engagement and some combination of, okay, you kind of know what you're supposed to do, but you get to be creative while you're doing it. This also has implications for what parents can do at home with their children, and I just excerpted, there was a online source, Katie Olson from Cubby at Home, interviewed me just a couple weeks ago about how parents might integrate music at home with their children. And so, just things like thinking about, okay, using lullabies to help children settle in at night, or having a 3-minute dance party when a parent gets home from work to energize children, to reconnect. And obviously you want to think about the different impact of different types of music or dance or arts engagement, because you can imagine that whereas a lullaby is soothing, that vigorous dance party is going to be energizing, right? That's not the thing you want to place just before bedtime. But definitely both can have positive impact in different ways. And to actually use creative outlets, to use music to reinforce routines and make routines fun for children. So these are strategies our partner Settlement Music School implements, but also some of them I learned from another arts partner in Minneapolis, the McPhail Center for Music, that has a Learning with Music program where they teach preschool classroom teachers how to integrate music into the classroom, including by using songs that you're already familiar with and changing the words to those to reinforce routines. So, when my now 14-year-old Max was a toddler, I remember I used to do instead of row, row, row your boat, brush, brush, brush your teeth, right? But just using the music to reinforce those daily routines and make them less tedious and more fun. Again, a combination of creativity and play and structure and routine seems to be best for lowering child stress levels under adverse environmental conditions. So in this study, we highlighted playtime and bedtime. Children who had more playtime at home had lower stress. So again, we're not saying structure your child's life by not letting them play. Actually, play seems to be really beneficial in terms of aiding the recovery from stress process. But then you do want to think about, where is structure important? Bedtime is probably one of those places. Children who had an earlier bedtime relative to wake time had lower stress levels. So we want to promote those biobehavioral processes like sleep that are likely to support and aid recovery from stress. And the CDC actually recommends that parents implement 15 minutes of special time or play listening each day, which would be not just letting your child go off and play by themselves, but actually playing with them, actually engaging with them in play, and really trying to have the type of play that's carefree, where you minimize the rules, where you actually minimize the teachable moments and focus on really having fun with them, helping them laugh and enjoy themselves. And, I can say as a parent, I don't fit that in every day, but I do try to fit it in a couple times a week. And if you're working with children in any capacity, whether it's education, therapy, babysitting, being a nanny, in all of those contexts, I think it's useful to think about, okay, given how much I have to tell this child what to do and they have to follow my rules and regulations, can I take a portion of the time and follow their lead and engage with them in play? Because that can be so healthy for the relationship as well as for their development. And then just one more piece we've highlighted through our research is promoting children's emotion knowledge. So this was an example of a study where we found that for children, again, facing economic adversity, that emotion knowledge actually related to lower cortisol levels. So even within adverse environmental conditions, if we can support children's development of emotion knowledge, that can help them regulate stress in the face of challenge. These were the results, but in terms of how we might do that, so how do you promote young children's emotion knowledge? And again, this is one of those areas that really takes shape in the early years, 3 to 5 is a critical period for growth, and those are the kids we're working with. Well, one thing is to label emotions in yourself and others. You might say, I feel a little sad today, or are you frustrated? And when you do that labeling, the specific sad rather than just a generalized upset, or using the word frustrated rather than a generalized bad, because then that cues particular ways to respond, particular ways to maybe change your emotional state eventually. Connecting labels to causes or triggers, like I'm feeling sad today because I miss grandma. Obviously don't want to overshare, but it's good for children to have some modeling of, yeah, this is why someone might feel a particular way. Asking them questions. Are you frustrated because you couldn't find the puzzle piece? And demonstrating emotion regulation strategies, like I'm going to play a happy song to change my mood, as well as helping them think about what might help them to change their mood or regulate. What might help you stay calm when you feel frustrated, right? So key takeaways from our work so far: environmental instability and chaos do get under the skin to influence child development. The climate emergency has a multiplier effect. Families facing poverty are disproportionately impacted, and that is likely to continue to be the case, but all of us are going to be increasingly influenced by instability and chaos that's caused by the climate emergency, which again just adds to the urgency of tackling these issues because it will have lasting effects on child development. So essential to end the climate emergency and to end poverty, and we can't really get around those issues. There's no way to solve those issues just by supporting an individual child, but en route to the broader goals of ending poverty and creating a sustainable planet, we do want to support individual children and families, and we can do that including by giving opportunities for creativity and play, as well as providing order, stability, and supporting children's development of emotional competence. So that's a lot to share. It's a big picture, and I wanted to be sure to take time for us to get to talk, for you to ask questions and have discussion around it. So thank you. Yeah.
So when a kid has like chronically elevated cortisol levels, is it like, are these interventions, especially with art music, are they preventative mostly? Are they things that can correct that like really high or even like leveled out like cortisol levels?
Yeah, that's a good question. And these are kind of cutting edge research questions, is how much can be changed through what amount of intervention at what stage. But yes, the best is always prevention, because if you can support children regulate stress before things get to a point of chronic elevation, or again, then flip from there to flattening out, that is the best. But we do have evidence that intervention works, particularly in, like, again, the earlier the better, right? So if we can intervene in early childhood, that's great. There are possibilities of still intervening later on. Our stress response systems have critical periods of development, including in early childhood, so they take shape during that period, but they can be influenced into adulthood. So things continue to matter. There's no point at which an intervention is not going to matter. And this is really an emergent research question, but we do have evidence that not only could a year of like getting good opportunities for creativity in the arts in preschool lead to lower cortisol levels, but for those kids that might already have the flattened out levels, it could help them get back to a state of better regulation. So we think both of those are possible. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
So when children who are growing up in households that don't have stability and don't have those close relationships with their family members, can other relationships outside the home, also like teachers and family, friends, and peers, can they also sort of
Right.
Like what kind of effect do those have?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are always cases where, and this is why, like, we study families facing economic hardship in parts in order to not fall into a deficit model where we assume that, okay, everyone who's, facing poverty conditions is going to show difficulties, because that's not the case. We also don't want to fall into, again, kind of a myth of resilience that says, oh, well, if you're just strong enough, or if you just have, one person come once a week and support you well, then that's going to be enough to, overcome all of these challenges you're facing on a daily basis. But it does matter. And anytime we see a kid who has kind of beat the odds and managed to do really well, even facing a lot of challenges at home, there's been someone who invested in them, someone who really supported their emotional well-being. And I can say, trained in these models about all of these risks that people face, it's like, okay, my mom faced all of those risks growing up. And so she ended up doing really well. She got out of poverty and became a professor of child development at the University of Delaware, right? She's the one in her family to kind of have gotten out. And so what allowed that to happen? And, a bunch of my mentors kind of shrugged their shoulders and are like, I don't know, she faced all the risks, but when I really think about it, like, she had a great aunt she'd go over to her great aunts, and her great aunt would read to her in the afternoons, and like maybe it was that promotive relationship that really made the difference for her so yes, it all matters, and it doesn't mean that just a single thing can help you escape all of the negative effects, but it's worth it to invest in a specific child. Yeah.
I was curious about long-term effects of this young elevated cortisol. Do we see any behavioral issues later? Do we see changes in the anatomy of those areas of the brain, like amygdala dysfunction, cortex? Is there anything that's clear on that, or is it still just an unknown area?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there are brain effects that we can observe later, and there are actually a couple of researchers in the Philly area doing some of that work. Again, all of that work, when we do brain scans, for example, it tends to be with just a few participants at once, and you never want to draw broad conclusions until the evidence base really accumulates. But in terms of the general principle of, do these have lasting impacts on brain development, and are we able to see that? Yes. Yeah.
Just two parts. How old were the kids that you were looking at in your research?
Yeah, so most of the children we're looking at are 3 to 5 year olds. They're preschool age. Yeah.
So then for the interventions, the arts and music thing, does that not create another barrier, if you have to pay for these kind of programs and things? Or
Absolutely.
Does public school art and music classes have the same effect, or does it need to be these specialized individual settings for students?
Yeah, such a great question. So we recently published a paper on the issue of arts equity, because this is huge, that across the past decades we've seen decreasing arts programming in public school settings, for example, and yet those are exactly the students whose families are probably not going to be able to afford expensive extracurricular music programs. And so where are children going to get these outlets? And program is a Head Start site. They are serving children facing economic hardship, and but they raise all these additional funds to support that extra arts programming. And one of the things that they are trying to do, and that our research is supporting them to do, is to develop a scalable model where Head Starts that don't have all that extra funding could implement some of the music and arts strategies into the regular classroom. And we're studying that right now. So we'll have information in a couple of years about how far can you get with just a little bit implemented in a regular classroom setting. But it's a big issue overall, right? We need more access to these kinds of creative outlets for children who are facing economic hardship. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So the cortisol levels will be determined by both how it's produced and how it's removed from the body, right? So do we know anything about the biochemistry of how it's removed, and then how that might be influenced by activity? So is cardio better than strength, or is concentrative activity, or a supplement able to, nutrition able to affect those pathways that clear cortisol?
That is a really good question. And yeah, so the research on exercise is interesting because you can imagine that most forms of vigorous exercise initially result in cortisol elevation, and yet we assume over time it's healthy. And there are a couple studies that have kind of found ways to document that like over time, for example, if you're engaging in vigorous exercise, you actually have less cortisol response to that. I can't answer all of your question, but what I can say is that, right, a big part of this, it's not just how do you respond to challenge, but how do you recover after. And when children are facing repeated or chronic stress, not only is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, not only is that leading to higher cortisol elevations in response to stress, but it takes longer to recover. It takes longer to come back to baseline afterward. And then and so that's absolutely one of the things that needs to be looked at, is that kind of recovery end of what are the things that we can do to actually promote the healthy recovery. Yeah, it's an incomplete answer to your question, but that's as far as I can get.
Do you know if there are any resources or programs that help to educate the families and parents about this and the ways that they can implement it?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so that's always a goal as a researcher, but hard to actually get to that point. So how do you actually give large numbers of parents access to information that could support their implementation of these strategies on a daily basis at home? And some of these popular press things are some efforts to do that. We've had a blog through our website at Westchester where some of our entries have focused on, okay, these are the this is what you can do at home based on this research. And at the actual Head Start sites we work with, we kind of give out flyers that try to make that translation between, okay, here's what we found, here's what this means for what you might be able to do at home. And again, it's always that balancing act between giving parents the information and strategies so that wherever they can implement, they have the information to guide that implementation, but also recognizing that the big picture issues that get in the way, right? That if the parent is juggling these multiple shifts or having to work different hours every day, then as much information as you can provide about routines are good for children, they're still not going to be able to establish a predictable and consistent routine. So, yeah. Yeah? Should we wrap up?
We are at 12:50, and we always pause at this moment because some people have to get to a class at 1. So please join me in thanking Professor Brown. And if there are more questions from our participants on Zoom or in the room, do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll stick around. And again, thanks so much for coming and for your engagement. Those are great questions. Yeah, would be happy to talk with you if you want to come up and talk.
Thank you.